Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to invite people after I'm done. I'm going to be speaking for about 35 minutes or so, and I want to invite people to come up. There are going to be some microphones, and we can have more discussion. One of the nice things about studying gender of any kind and sexuality is everybody's got some experience, and almost everybody's got very firm opinions. And very seldom do they coincide with those of others. So there's always good discussion to be had. So I want to start off with the basic question. Are men animals? And the obvious question is, of course they are. The more interesting question and the more human question is, so what? What does that mean? Not in the sense of, is that important or not, but what does it mean to call men animals? And what about women as well? One of the interesting things is when we're talking about women and they're compared to animals, at least in English in the United States, and when they're compared positively, the mama bear and the instinct, the maternal instinct to protect one's young is one of the things that comes in. Then a couple of questions. True or false? Men cannot control their sexual or violent natures. Can't do it. Well, you could say this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but I kind of know what you're getting at. Another question, true or false? Men have to be controlled by society and by women. Many people you might talk to would say, that's an exaggeration, but I even more see what you're getting at here in terms of men needing to be controlled. One of the questions I'm looking at in this presentation is why biology seems to be so compelling as a way to explain what people do and what they don't do. Genes, hormones, genetics, evolution. A lot of people feel very, very comfortable these days saying, boys will be boys. What are you going to do? That's just the way it is. And so I'm trying to look beyond what we might assume to be the obvious. And I want you to take the example of murder, okay? Most murderers in the United States are men. We know this, right? I have a graph. It shows that 9 out of 10 murderers, when we know the sex of the murderer, 9 out of 10 murderers are men. Is this important? Obviously, it's quite important. There are a lot more murderers who are men than women. But what conclusions do we draw here? We could say that men are 9 times as likely as women to murder. That's undoubtedly true given those statistics. And these statistics are relatively constant from one year to another. We could also say that men are 9 times as violent as women. That's a problem, because what we mean by violence is murder, but it's also a lot of other things included. If there is a horrible shooting, a mass killing in the United States, these things are happening all the time now. All you know about is some school, some shopping mall. It happens. What are the assumptions you might make? They're male, they're young. If you made those assumptions, you would seldom be wrong. But I have a big circle. It shows 9/10 male, 1/10 woman. Okay, that's the percentage of murderers who are men versus women. But then I have 2 giant cones. 2 giant cones. One, the male population in the United States. The other, the female population in the United States. At the very, very, very top of the male, it's a yellow cone. You see a tiny little red part. That's the murderers among males. You can't even see the red part among the females. So that difference is significant. But the question is, if it's biological, if it's also biological, what happened to the rest of the cone? Now, there may be murderers in this room, I don't know. But statistically speaking, there's a very good likelihood that there are none, and that no men in here, or women for that matter, but we'll talk about men for a second, that no men in here are going to murder. And if you have a theory about male violence, you need to account for all the men in this room as well as those who do commit murder this year and any other year. I want to talk about some of the implications for these things in two places. One is Mexico, where I've lived and worked in a squatter settlement in Mexico City for over 20 years. And the other is the United States, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the US military, a biology classroom, and an alcohol rehabilitation program in Oakland, California. I was talking in September this year in Mexico City with an old friend named Norma. And Norma was telling me about a problem in the neighborhood where I'd lived and worked and where she lives. And she was saying that there was a young man, and the young man was getting into a lot of fights. He was hanging out with gangs, and the family was very concerned, and some of the neighbors who'd been the neighbors of this boy since he'd grown up. They wanted to know why he was doing it and how it could be stopped. And all of a sudden, someone remembered this kid's great-grandfather had participated in the Mexican Revolution about 100 years ago in the 1910s. And it was clear. That's why the kid is violent today, many thought, because his great-grandfather had been violent, and in a Lamarckian kind of way, it had gotten passed on through the generations. This kind of casual reference to biology is exactly what I'm interested in thinking about. I then have a photograph. I have great photographs. I'll send them to you in the mail. Of a metro stop in Mexico City. I took it also in September. And there is a hand-drawn sign on a board, but it's in the metro stop, and it says solo mujeres, and only women and kids under 10 years old. Because what you have in the subway system in Mexico City and Sao Paulo and some other cities in Latin America are subway cars that at certain times are only for women and small children. The reason is obvious, because this way they can avoid being molested, touched by men in unwanted ways. There's also a big debate, however, in Mexico City about these cars. Should they exist or not? Those who say boys will be boys, what are you going to do? That's just the way men are, say that's what we need. Those who say, no, this is not the way men are, this is the way men have been behaving, some men, and we need to stop that. And we can stop that. And we don't capitulate to these men by essentially telling the women, look, if the only way to be safe is to separate yourselves from the men. Again, reference to what are we born with and what is adopted, what can be changed. I want to talk about a different kind of violence, now shifting to the United States. A man named Demond Mullins. Demond was on the dean's list at CUNY, the university in New York City. He had to drop out. This was around 1999, I think it was. He had to drop out because he didn't have enough money to pay for it. So he joined the New York National Guard. Lo and behold, in about 2000, lo and behold, 9/11 takes place. The next thing he knows, a couple of years later, he's sent to Iraq. This wasn't his plan. That's not why he joined. He joined for money that he would get after college. Nonetheless, he ends up in Iraq. Demond lasts out his tour of duty. He's on his last mission. He's coming back to the base camp from his tour of duty. He's shouting. All the other guys are shouting, we made it, we're going home. He said, I'm not wounded, I'm not missing any body parts, I'm alive, I'm going home. His commanding officer, his XO, comes up to him as he comes into the base, and he said, Demond, now you're a man. So Demond said, what is it that makes me a man? Is it that I fought in a war? Is it that I have been a warrior in the streets of Iraq? Is it that I've shot and killed people? Is that what makes me a man? What is it exactly that the commanding officer is referring to. He said, I was 22 when I got here to Iraq. He said, I was a man then. And he continued to be very bothered by this notion. He said, is it because I was violent, or is it the potential for violence that makes me a man in the eyes of some people? Needless to say, when he got back to the US, he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Let me talk about a different kind of violence still. And this comes from an alcohol rehabilitation program that I studied in Oakland, California, several years ago. Like a lot of rehabilitation programs, you walk in, you sit around in a circle, and everyone says why they're there that night. And we started off with a guy named Jimmy. And Jimmy explained that he'd arrived in San Francisco Bay Area in the Haight-Ashbury days and took LSD and a whole bunch of other drugs, but he really liked alcohol. That's what he especially was drawn to. And he said, you know why I like to drink so much? And we all said, no, we don't. Tell us. He said, it's because, he was from Philadelphia, if I remember correctly. He said, it's because I'm from German stock. And that's why I have a craving for alcohol. After Jimmy, there was a guy named Dennis in the circle. He said, my God, that really explains a great deal for me. He said, I'm half German. And he said, that half has to have booze. He said, the problem is the other half, which is Filipino. And he'd seen a program on PBS, and he'd learned about something that doctors call the Asian flushing factor. And he'd misunderstood, in fact, what it is. It just means that a higher percentage of people from Asia, it's vasodilation. They turn red. That doesn't mean they don't have a tolerance. It just means that a higher percentage blush. And so he'd understood this as to be intolerance. But what Jimmy was doing was saying, essentially, he had a genetic civil war going on in his body between the Germans and the Filipinos. And this explained not only why he wanted to drink, but why he was going crazy, trying to figure out his cravings and all this. And what's interesting to me is that since time immemorial, it seems, or at least the last 150 years, there have always been plenty of scientists, not all, not most perhaps, who've discovered the biological roots of culture, the biological roots of ethnicity, the biological roots of racial differences. And now these ideas, in some ways, have become more and more popular, particularly with reference to men and women. And I want to invoke here a very famous French philosopher and feminist who, a little more than 60 years ago, her name Simone de Beauvoir, a little more than 60 years ago, she said, look, if you want to understand women, you have to understand something about biology. But, she said, and that but was very important, I deny that biology gives women anything fixed. In other words, biology is not destiny. Oddly enough, I think since that time, increasingly, in this society and others, we've come to think of men's destiny as very linked, whether we like it or not, what are you going to do with their biology? They're driven by certain things. So I want to move now, talk a little bit more about sexuality instead of just violence. Mexico, 1960s, 1970s, similar to other parts of the world, birth control comes on the market like never before in human history. All of a sudden, contraceptives are available to women in a widespread way like never before. Men had actually, in Mexico and elsewhere, participated perhaps more actively in contraception prior to this, condoms and withdrawal in particular. After this period, however, men are, in Mexico and several other countries, essentially planned out of family planning. They're not part of the major campaigns in very many countries, with exceptions, but not many countries, starting in the 60s and especially picking up in the 70s. What happens is, if you go back and look at the documents of Planned Parenthood, the United Nations, and the government documents from Mexico, in fact, it was assumed men, all they want to do is spread their seed, all they want to do is have more babies, all they want to do is have more sex with as many women as they can, which fits very neatly with certain biologists' thinking today. Therefore, what's the point of even approaching these men and trying to get them involved? Let's focus on the women and women's health, which was a very important and good thing at the time. But what happened is the assumption that there aren't men who really care about limiting the number of children, who want to plan the spacing of their children, who want to have a loving and respectful sexual relationship with their wife. So essentially, because of preconceptions about what men are like, men were planned out. Again, this was in Mexico and other countries. Another example of preconceptions about biology from Mexico, but more recently. I was talking with a young man, a college student named Miguel Miguelito, I call him, because I've known him since he was about 4 years old. He's in college, as I say now. He's very active in student politics. He really wants to change the world. And when I asked him, and you can tell I'm in the habit these days of asking people about men's nature and women's nature and what they think might be the same or different. He said, listen, Matt, don't get excited about biology and biological differences. Culture is what counts, and that's what we can change. Society and culture, you have to focus on that. We continued talking, and I asked if he had a girlfriend. He said, not at the moment, but he certainly intended to get married. I said, well, what kind of things would you be looking for in a future wife? He said, she should be kind, she should be smart, she should be pretty. And he said, and of course she has to have big hips. I said, why does she have to have big hips? He said, well, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that women with big hips have babies more easily. That's why every man finds a woman with big hips more attractive. This was just obvious, and he didn't even think it fit into men's nature, women's nature, and basic things like that. Now, my own assumption is he falls in love with a young woman who doesn't have particularly big hips. I don't think it's going to be an issue, but that's certainly the preconception that he's going in. I want to turn now to a different population entirely and draw on work of an anthropologist at NYU, whose name is Emily Martin. And Emily Martin has a habit of going through and reading textbooks from biology, medical schools, taking classes in endocrinology, and seeing how people are taught about different things. And she studied one particular topic that I think is relevant here, and I want to talk about two pseudoscientific fairy tales about the sperm and the egg. Textbooks, until fairly recently, when they're describing sperm, use words like amazing, remarkable capacity. They produce hundreds of millions every day, these men. While men are producing, women, on the other hand, are slowly shedding. Things are degenerating. They're just not working the same way. One textbook of endocrinology says it's a mystery why so many eggs are formed, about 400 reach full maturity in a woman. Why so many eggs are formed, 400, only to die, the poor things, in the ovaries. The real mystery, however, as Martin points out, is that a man, I didn't know this, men produce 2 trillion sperm in a lifetime. The real mystery is why nobody's upset about all that waste. Every time a man goes to the bathroom, millions of sperm, literally down the toilet. So assuming 2 offspring, let's say, per couple, so you got 200 eggs wasted.
about 1 trillion sperm wasted for each kid. So that's Emily Martin's tale 1. Tale 2, I think, is even more interesting. And it's how eggs are somehow so feminine and sperm so masculine. An egg is large and passive, it's said. It idly drifts along the fallopian tunnel of love. That's mine. I don't want to attribute that to Emily Martin. You got mighty men producing sperm that are streamlined. They're naughty. They're very active. They journey. They're like missiles, rockets. They deliver the payload. This is the payload. Delivering the payload comes out of a textbook, okay? I'm not making that stuff up. They activate. The sperm activates the developmental program of the egg. Sperm have a mission. Eggs die unless rescued, literally, rescued by sperm. Martin actually studied some of the most cutting-edge studies of endocrinology, of eggs and sperm, and it turns out, lo and behold, there was a little bit of bias growing that had crept into people's descriptions. And when you looked through a less biased lens, it turned out that sperm have really very little direction. They kind of just go back and forth, and if anything, they're trying to escape from the egg. And the egg, on the contrary, the egg, it is thought, traps, captures the sperm. Now, you don't want to take this one too far either. The whole point is they don't have brains, they don't have consciousness, so let's just relax a little bit before we attribute too much to these folks, okay? They're not folks either, I apologize. But how easy is it to take what we think is sort of normal, men chase women, women are chased, and when we look at some part of biology, say, oh, well, that must be going on there. It really starts at the molecular level, these kinds of social relationships. We're shifting radically across the Pacific. I was in China for a month in October, and I had the opportunity to talk to a man named Teacher Li. Wasn't never a school teacher. He's a retired factory worker now, but he has a lot of respect from people in his neighborhood. And I was asking him about men's nature, women's nature. What did he think? He said, well, it's really important that you understand that women, essentially, one of the things they're trying to do is protect their handsome men. I said, okay. He said, listen, I swear to God, this was not prompted. He said, listen, it's kind of like the egg and the sperm. Which is why I'm giving you the example, because it was so coincidental. He said the sperm essentially is there. The egg has to protect it. It surrounds the sperm to protect it. Then he invoked another biological term. Without a prompt from me, he said that when men see beautiful women, their hormones go up. It was a chemical reaction, he assured me. Okay, one more anecdote. This time it's a little more personal. I was living in the squatter settlement in Mexico City. My wife and our then infant child went back to the US for a couple of weeks to visit family. And I bumped into a neighbor in the market, and she asked if they'd gotten off. I said yes. And she said, okay, te estamos vigilando, eh? We're keeping an eye on you. I took it a little personally, and she said, no, this doesn't have to do with you personally. This is men. They can't help themselves. If offered, they accept. So she said, really what we're going to be doing is keeping an eye on the other women. All right. Now here are some examples I've given you from Mexico, China. How are we doing on time? All right. Mexico, China, and the United States. It would be very easy to say what we have going on is a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. Very easy. It's a lot of people who know a little bit about biology, misusing it, misusing the terminology, and misapplying the concepts. On the left, you see a ram. On your right, you see a peacock. Above the ram, it says male-male competition. Above the peacock, it says female choice. Below the ram, it says combat. Males bigger than females have weapons. In other words, the horns. Below the female choice and peacock, females choose based on quality of males. In other words, the peahen chooses the prettiest peacock. This was a slide from an introductory biology class that some students sent me. You could ask, are just rams and peacocks being discussed in this class on sexual selection? In fact, they're not. They got insects, they got all sorts of other non-human animals. The punchline of the entire class, however, is two more slides. One is of, it looks like high school football players. The other one, high school cheerleaders. Human animals. Next to the males, it says males should be competitive, fight for additional mates. The football players is the image. Next to the females, females should be choosy, allocate their expensive resources efficiently. Now you could say he's just goofing around, the professor. He's just throwing up some funny pictures, and I have nothing against cheerleaders. My wife was a head cheerleader in high school. I played bad football in high school, so I'm not against these things. But such talk, casual talk, classroom talk, TV talk, has real implications. People learn things. People take things from this. So the question is, what do we do with this kind of thinking? Men are basically, according to this biology professor, going through life saying yes, 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 and waiting for the woman who's going, no, 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 maybe, yes. And that's the way men are, and that's the way women are. No, that's the way males are of all the animal species, including human, and that's the way females are, as if it's all the same thing, and I think that has some implications. Another graphic. A young man named Adam Lanza. Does that name ring a bell? Newtown. 20 students, 7 adults murdered. This is in Connecticut. University of Connecticut geneticists, it was reported in the New York Times, were quietly making plans to study the DNA of Adam Lanza, 20, who killed 20 children and 7 adults in Newtown, Connecticut. Their work is an effort to discover, this is all quotes from the article, biological clues of extreme violence. You can read about Anthony Weiner and the neurological roots of his sexual needs. These have also been reported on. Really? Is this where we're going? The availability of firearms in the United States. Why are more of these killings taking place in the US than anywhere else on earth? Biological? Why males more than females? All right, some people would say biological. Why more young men? Maybe, testosterone tends to go down, but not until you're much older in men in the United States. Why now more than in the past if it's also biological? And if the problem is crazy here, why is this how crazy manifests itself? There's a lot of ways to be crazy. Why is this the way? If we're looking for biology to explain it all, we're going to miss all sorts of social indicators, social problems that we need to be addressing. And this is where I'm going to be concluding. I think we've reached a comfort level that for some used to be found in religion and now is found in blind scientific faith. It's easier to say, what are you going to do? For some, you could say it's God's will. For others, you could say it's biology. I wish it were different, but that's just the way it is. There's actually not much we can do about these things. It's magical thinking and biobabble, according to some. Biobabble in contrast to what the late Stephen Jay Gould, paleontologist, called the messy richness of life. The messy richness of life. And what's wrong with messy? What's wrong with it? Well, take mental illness. For a lot of people, if you want to talk about mental illness, it's easier to talk about a chemical imbalance, something physical, than to sort of say, well, mental disturbances. That's very amorphous. It's easier to talk about serotonin levels. It's easier to talk about brain disease than it is to talk about crazy or irrational. So I'm almost finished here, and if people would like to start thinking of questions or comments, please do so, and I think we're going to be moving the mics shortly. The final image is actually a picture, a painting from Picasso called A Simian Self-Portrait. So it's Picasso drawing himself as a monkey from 1903. And I end by offering, we like our art messy. We don't like it too stick figurey. We call that children's drawings. Why not our science? Why not what it means to be men as animals and women as animals? Men are animals, women are animals, but what that means is not so cut and dry. Is male biology male destiny? I think we have to say no, it's not. If we look at war, if we look at mass shootings, if we look at rape, we have a choice. We can say, oh, men rape, that's just what men do. It's biologically driven. And there are some, not many, but there are some who argue that. Scientists, not just anthropologists. If we say that, then we are giving up on being able to do something short of changing people's biology around. And I think that if so, we never, ever are going to be able to deal with such calamities in the future. So on that happy note, I thank you. So, are there any comments or questions? People should come down here, or yes? Okay, great.
Have there been any studies since, say, in the last 20 or 30 years about women as they have become more aggressive, for instance, in the workplace? And has that given anybody pause about art and biology alone?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that question exactly, except to say that if you remember, I was talking about the murder rate and are men 9 times more violent. I said, obviously they murder 9 times more than women. In the US, I should qualify. I don't know what these numbers look like elsewhere. But I then said, are they 9 times more violent? There are studies, and they're also controversial, so I don't want everybody to go out and be sure of this, but it's worth thinking about. That different forms of violence, actually, you may find women participating in more. Slaps, punches, throwing things, and such. When things get really violent, including murder, men are overwhelmingly, nobody disputes that. The first set are disputed, but I think there's some evidence that there are some forms of violence that women participate in. In Mexico, interestingly enough, when anybody talks about domestic violence, psychological violence is considered completely a part of it. It doesn't have to be physical. So you also get really confusing kinds of numbers in terms of yelling is considered violent in many places in some of how we look. So it's a great question, and I need to know more about it, but I don't, and I won't pretend I do. Oh yeah, thank you.
One of the few good things that come out of the mess in, am I there? One of the few good things that come out of the mess in Washington is these group of, I think, 22 women, that senators that are finding ways to compromise and talk to one another as reasonable people. And that gives me great optimism for the future of women in government.
All right, thank you. Please.
I've been really interested in the way that the NFL hazing has been covered. And it's not that women don't haze, because certainly there have been instances even of people driven to suicide by female hazing. But it's kind of a variation of boys will be boys. It's NFL teams will be NFL teams. Do you have any?
I've just been reading in the newspapers about this. You can also go back a few years, and there's hazing in military academies. And there have been a lot of interesting studies about some of these. There's this line of what is normal, natural, good plain fun, and what crosses the line. What's interesting here is also you have an issue of race, as I understand it. And that in the United States often, anything that crosses that line is out of bounds. But I don't know enough about the particularities of the NFL. I've actually been learning. I didn't realize there was this much sort of accepted hazing going on. I'm not shocked, but I didn't know that. Thank you.
So I would argue that in Abu Ghraib prison, a woman was very violent. One woman was known who tortured the prisoners, particularly. It was everywhere on TV. So I would argue then that it's because men known as more violent, because they basically go as soldiers and only volunteers in the United States is very few, basically, and in other words, they're not going. Therefore, I would propose to check the level of violence in Israel, where females and males go in equal amounts. If in Israel, for example, I don't know the data, it will be comparable, it suggests that violence is actually social rather than biological, that you suggest.
Thank you. The case of Israel and the case of conscription is interesting. There are about 70 countries around the world that have conscription today. U.S. is obviously not one of them. The U.S., by the way, has about 15% women in the military. Now combat is more or less accepted, although there are some gradations there. Even, however, in Israel, which is it's the only place I know of that actually conscripts women, it's for shorter periods of time, and their assignments are generally different, and it's much easier to get out of if you're a woman in Israel. But one of the questions I always ask my students, and I teach at Brown, for goodness sake, I say, how many of you, a class, of 100 kids, let's say, I'll say, how many of you have been in the military? Maybe once in 5 years a hand goes up, but usually no hands. How many of you know anybody in the military? Often nothing. I say, if we go down the road to the Community College of Rhode Island, how do you think it might be different? Nonetheless, so that's sort of a class thing, but nonetheless, the fact is that I also ask them, I say, how many of you are 18? Most of them are 18. I say, how many of you had to go and report to somebody when you were 18? You had to go sign something, fill in a form, selective service. All the boys raise their hands, none of the girls do. I say, why? Nobody has a good answer. Nobody in the world has a good answer. They just, well, that's just the way it is. And so conscription around the world is still overwhelmingly almost all men. United States, we don't have conscription, but you have to, by law. Interesting, complete tangent. Illegal aliens, by law, have to register. They cross the border, they have to register with the Selective Service. I swear to God, look at the rules. As I say, it's a tangent. In any case, why is this? Why do we think that's normal? Okay, way back when everybody was carrying spears and shields and all this kind of stuff, you could say, brute upper body strength. That's just, nobody thinks that anymore. Okay? But yet we accept this. My guess is nobody here has ever sort of thought much about it, and that's just the way it is, and your kids or you yourselves. When you turn 18, that's what happens, if you're male. Thank you.
My question isn't about violence per se, but it's more generally about the nature of men versus women. I have a family member who's a female-to-male transsexual, and so for 2 years it was sort of like observing a living laboratory. Somebody who had been acculturated as a woman, but with the testosterone evolved into being a man. And it was pretty interesting stuff. So I'm just curious, I mean, is there potential in studying that? Is that?
There is. There's a guy at Stanford, a neurobiologist named Robert Sapolsky, who has a book called The Trouble with Testosterone that's fascinating because he says people often make a correlation between violence and testosterone. I'm getting back to violence a little bit, but it would probably apply to sexuality. He said most people think if you have a higher level of testosterone, that's going to lead to higher level of violence. He said you have a choice. Either if there's a correlation, he said either there's no correlation between the two at all, or violence leads to a rise in testosterone levels, or testosterone levels lead to higher testosterone levels lead to more violence. He said actually what is the closest to the truth is that violence and violent activity will lead to a rise in testosterone levels. And he studied both baboons in Kenya, but also humans in the United States. And what he says is that between very low levels, I think it was 20% of normal in the US, and by the way, testosterone levels vary from one part of the world to another, and diet in particular. From 20% of normal to, I think it's 4 times normal, you do not see any correlation, by and large, between violence. He said you get above that heavy steroid use, you get below that castration, you will find a relationship. But that in the common, I mean, look at all the ads on TV. Look at all the ads in newspapers and magazines and stuff for, what is it called, big T or something? That men have to deal with this. There are some medical conditions where it makes some sense. But mainly, I think, I haven't looked into this as much as I'd like to, I think that the relationship between testosterone and being a real man is exaggerated tremendously. And this is an example of how people invoke biology, in this case hormones, to explain human behavior. And I think they use it as a pretext for not actually dealing with human relationships as much as they might, both individual and social. Thank you.
Hi, I'm interested in knowing whether you've spoken with anyone that doesn't self-identify as male or female, and whether they've made any biological references.
I haven't. I haven't, but that would be great to do. Just a funny academic story here. I was asked to give this talk. I said I don't do animals, and then all of a sudden I said, wait a minute, men are animals. And since then I started actually studying the question and going out and doing interviews. So it's thanks to the festival here. I really should thank you guys for the inspiration of a new research project of mine. And that will, I hope, be part of it. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have any comments on the idea about sexuality and emotion and kind of the ideals in our society that are put forth that men biologically are separated emotionally from sex, and that women aren't, but to be sexually liberated, they have to be, and if that has any effects, I guess, on violence and abuse.
Thank you. It has to do with the relationship between emotions, for instance, and men, if I understand correctly, both with respect to sexuality and other things. And, if you ask, for instance, how many men in the room have cried in the last, month, how many women have cried in the last year, let's say, my guess is more women than men in the room, regardless of age or anything else, have cried. Now, the question is that biological? So just to give a little plug for anthropology, there are actually fascinating studies of other cultures around the world around emotions. And lo and behold, some of what we have thought was universal, and this is what men do, this is what women do, or more importantly, this is the way people, men or women, express emotions, anger, fear, sadness, happiness, all these kinds of things. It turns out there is tremendous variation in other societies. So that expressions of anger, which we may say, well, come on, if you're angry, it's good to express it. As long as you don't hurt anybody. Let it out. In other societies, this is quite frowned upon. So that the argument for biology dictating these things is certainly weakened by some of the cross-cultural comparisons that anthropologists have done along these lines. And that this links in turn with approaches with men's emotional investment or emotional engagement with sex or violence or anything else, as well as women's.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the role of addiction for some of these things for men. When does it take hold, and is there behavioral ways that become non-thinking and behave as an addiction?
I don't want to be seen as a biology basher. And I don't mean to at all. What I'm trying to do is provide a counterweight to what I think is too widespread acceptance and on a fairly superficial level. That said, take addictions and biology. There is good evidence, not that you are alcoholic because your father was, but that there may be a genetic link of this has made it a little harder for you to resist. Which means that you don't have to become an alcoholic if your father was. Nobody would argue that, I think, today. But that in fact there are some kinds of proclivities that can affect you. And this can be very similar. Just because your mother had breast cancer does not mean you will. But it might mean that you have to be extra careful on that front. And so I think that addictions is, and I think most addictions counselors are not satisfied with saying, oh, it's all in your genes. But you don't want to discount it all. While you don't want to discount it altogether, it's mainly something that through therapy and through other means, social means, psychological means, can be addressed most effectively.
I recently read some work by Franz de Waal and his work specifically with chimpanzees and bonobos.
Right.
And I'm interested how you see primatology and their work and
Brilliant.
how that should inform what you do as an anthropologist.
Okay.
What are, like, as you see it, what are some of the benefits or pitfalls of that area of research?
Thank you. Franz de Waal, I understand, he spoke this year during the festival. I only wish I lived in Chicago and could have heard him. But in fact, he's agreed to be interviewed. I already have an appointment to go down to Atlanta and interview him. He is a pioneer, and very briefly, most of us in this room, I'm guessing, have watched nature shows, or if we think about chimpanzees, we think about chimpanzee groups as alpha male led, and we think that they fight a lot. Apparently, that's what chimps do. And they are, or rather, they're not our ancestor, but we share a common ancestor with the chimps. What's interesting is de Waal comes along, and he studies a group called the bonobos, or bonobos, sometimes pronounced, used to be called the pygmy chimps. Turns out, more often than not, they are alpha female-led, and they like to have sex a lot more than they like to fight. For some reason, people make reference to the chimps more than they do to the bonobos. Why? Well, I would argue that one reason, at least, is that this conforms to a sort of Hobbesian notion of war, the one against the other, and that this is sort of human nature, and that we need to have society to control us, and all this. The notion that we have a common ancestor that developed into a being that wants to have sex a lot more than it wants to make war, wants to fight, that is led by women, 22 representatives is a start. This does not conform with the way things have been, at least to date. This challenges that. And I think that it is much easier to make reference to chimps. It makes it all look much more natural. You bring in the bonobos and all of a sudden, wait a minute, then we can't really attribute all the, oh no, this is getting confusing. And so I would think that. I don't know what he said, but I've read his books, and I would urge you all to do the same. Franz de Waal.
My
question has to do with this idea of masculinity and whether or not any of your research has explored the potential connection between masculinity, even hypermasculinity, and mass psychology. And I'm thinking about phenomena like Nazi Germany, for example, this idea of the sort of fetishized male and also male body sort of being this idealized, sort of impossible, unattainable thing. So I'm wondering if any of your research has touched on anything.
My research hasn't per se. There was a historian, he's now dead, from University of Wisconsin named George Mossey, who actually studied the Nazis, studied masculinity, and he studied in particular everything from statues and body types to gymnasiums. In other words, sports and how the cult of the body developed, particularly the male body. And that this was a particular fetish of an Aryan masculinity. So again, George Mossey would be another reference. Very accessible, fun history to read. Well, not fun, but anyway. Good reading. Okay, last question. Not up to me, I'm afraid, sorry.
Yes, I wanted to ask, you talked a lot about casual references to biology or about some bad examples, bad uses of science and biology and so on. So I'm wondering, what would be some positive examples, so to say, where you see that kind of interdisciplinary work really contributed to better understanding, or what do you see as the best area for potential collaboration?
Well, I talked about bad science, I didn't talk enough about good science, and where some good science might be doing some better work. I tried to, and I'll just go back over. Stephen Jay Gould, a paleontologist, who did a lot of work on questions of race, for instance, in a book called Mismeasure of Man, also very accessible, very readable, where he talked about the history of studying racial differences and how scientists just got it wrong, and invented, but it was also scientific that other people felt reluctant to challenge. Robert Sapolsky, neurobiologist at Stanford, who has written extensively on some of these questions of hormones in particular. Frans de Waal, another scientist, a primatologist. He's at Emory, and he runs something called the Yerkes Primate Lab. So those would be three people. There are many, many more. Sarah Hardy, who is a biological anthropologist at UC Davis, is studied in particular mothering among primates and humans. These are some of the people that might be worth looking at, and who've thought about some of the gender and cross-species stuff and what you can do. And it's the anthropomorphizing. It's so attractive. It's so much fun to look at a baboon harem and call it a harem. And then you say, wait a minute, what's a harem? Oh, I don't even know what a harem is. You know, for people who have them, I know what the stereotype is, but now I'm applying it to baboons? I'm sorry? We need to end. I'm so sorry, but thank you very much.